Welcome to Retirement, the Great Escape Plan. I'm Jenny Brown, CEO of JBS Financial Strategists and author of Retirement, the Great Escape Plan. This podcast is about rethinking retirement, not just the numbers, but the life you're planning for. In each episode, the JBS team, along with special guests, will explore real conversations, real experiences, and the decisions that help people approach retirement with clarity and confidence. Because thriving should be fun and naps should be epic. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to Retirement, the Great Escape Plan. I'm Jenny Brown, CEO of JBS Financial Strategists and author of Retirement, the Great Escape Plan. This podcast is about rethinking retirement, not just the numbers, but the life you're planning for, because thriving should be fun and naps should be epic. So today I'm really excited. We're talking about aging and specifically aged care and planning ahead because you have to. You know, this isn't about the fear or losing independence. It's about protecting your choices and making life easier for the people you love. One of the biggest surprises that I see is that couples don't always, age at the same pace. One partner may need help earlier, sometimes suddenly, and the other partner becomes the carer. Planning ahead isn't pessimistic, it's kind. I also see people who want to stay at home for as long as possible, and many can. The people that do it best don't do it alone. They build support early. Independence doesn't mean doing everything for yourself. It means knowing where to turn. And then there are families who where a fall or health changes absolutely everything and absolutely immediately. They suddenly, decisions are urgent. Assessments, forms, costs, questions about the home, the pension, the will, the stress, we're trying to help people avoid. So to talk through calmly and practically, I'm joined by two fabulous advisors and colleagues at JBS. They're both aged care specialists from the team, and they have these conversations every single day. So Kaitlin, Mifsud and Peter Folk, welcome to the podcast. So Kaitlin, let me start, with you. When you're talking with clients, what's usually that moment that makes people realise that they really should have planned for aging and aged care earlier, before a crisis hits?
I think you alluded to it a little bit, Jenny, that it's often reactive rather than proactive. So that's what we see a lot, and it's normally after something's already happened, like a fall, and then the hospitals is telling, the kids that mum or dad can't go home, unfortunately, or it's after a diagnosis like dementia, things start getting harder to manage at home. And normally it's never too late to have those conversations. But often when the first conversation is happening at that point, it does add a bit of pressure and makes people think we should have started planning this earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in planning earlier, it's very much, about the doable stuff. It's, not dramatic. What happens when it actually, is dramatic in that regard, Kaitlin? Have you, dealt with clients that all of a sudden they're in care and then you've got to sort out the problems?
Yeah, and it's important to remember that a lot of the times we're not dealing with the clients at that point. We're often dealing with the kids of the clients. And, they're coming to us saying, I'm not even sure what mum and dad wanted. We never discussed this. I'm not even sure about their financial position a lot of the time as well. So the first step is always to just get everyone to take a breath and go, let's just take stock of the situation, of what we're trying to achieve here, and take it one step at a time. And it's important to know too that you don't need to make all those decisions at once, and to really just take a breather and think about what your options are.
That's so true. So it keeps people in control by taking that breath, sitting back and reviewing really what needs to be done.
Yeah. And if I can jump in there, I think one thing I'd encourage a lot of people, and Kaitlin and I have done it with a couple of clients, it's really important at some stage, even if you, as you said, things can happen overnight. We've seen that happen with clients. 1 minute they're really healthy. Next minute, as you said, something like a fall, or they've had a turn of health, suddenly they need to go into aged care. And something Kaitlin and I have done is we've actually sat down with a few clients and got them to bring their family in for a family meeting. And that's where we discuss with them a lot about what the next stage is. And a lot of those meetings haven't necessarily been technical. They haven't really been on the numbers. It's more realizing things around, okay, parents have a will. What does that stipulate? Parents have powers of attorney, which is really important in this scenario. Who are those powers of attorney, and are they happy with it? Because a lot of the time, it's surprisingly, the kids don't even know that they're their parents' powers of attorney. Or when you're dealing with several siblings, suddenly it's like, oh, hold on, this person's the decision maker, not this person. So it's really important to sit down and have those conversations, and even help, from a parent's point of view. You don't necessarily have to get into numbers. We do deal with some clients that are very private about their finances, don't necessarily want their family to know how much they've got. But it's as much as anything to say, well, if something does happen and we do need to go into aged care, we've got the funds to sort it out. And importantly, we introduce to JBS, because they don't necessarily know who we are, so they know who to come to when the time comes. Because the thing, and I'm really looking forward to unpacking this more, because aged care is such a convoluted and complex system if you don't know it. But it doesn't necessarily need to be, and you need to make sure that you're talking to the right people. So I'd, from a practical point of view, I'd be sitting down with a family, and whether you bring in someone like a JBS to help mediate that conversation, it's really important to make sure people know where things are at, who's got powers of attorney, where wills and things like that, who to get in contact with you early on, because that makes a whole world of difference when the time comes that something happens and you've got to go into aged care.
That's so true. So when you say mediate, because I know you don't really mean mediate, you really mean to be the conductor, don't you? To actually draw out the questions from our clients, and then draw out the concerns from our clients' kids, and obviously you have that conversation first with the clients, explaining what the family meeting's all about. And then be that conductor from that point of view.
Correct. Thanks for correcting me on that terminology.
No.
It's not mediating. It is jumping in and having a conversation with the family and helping control the situation, or as I like to put, sometimes you tap them into line, you give them the questions to ask, or set the agenda to help them talk things through. Yeah.
And it's so valuable, because the last thing that you want is something happening and a doctor coming in saying, mum or dad don't have capacity anymore to make decisions. And then where do you go? So as the advisor, it's so important for us to then make sure that we know who has the power of attorney and what mum and dad's, wishes really are.
Yeah, correct. And without unpacking too much and going too online, the other practical tip, make sure you got powers of attorney and wills in place.
Absolutely.
It is so much harder when you don't have that stuff in place to when the time comes.
And make sure your advisor's got copies of them.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah. And look, I know, from a personal experience, my brother and I just automatically assumed that I was the main, legal personal representative for my mum, because I tended to do all the financial stuff, and my brother did all the maintenance around the house. When we actually unpacked and looked at a copy of the power of attorney in the will when we needed to, it was actually joint. So we both had to actually make the decisions jointly, which is not a problem, but we were always led to believe that it was me and then him if I couldn't do it. But that's not the case. And so that's something that's really important, again, because if one person is maybe overseas, it makes that decision making so much harder, to then, and the time just stretches, because you make a decision today in Australia's time and then somebody's on the other side of the world, and it can take 12 hours to get an answer back and things like that. Yeah. So, okay. So Peter, in terms of, what decisions do you think or do you see people make with the best of intentions, often to help the family, that can unintentionally create either financial, estate planning, or Centrelink issues later?
Yeah, the biggest one I've come across, and I'm not sure if you've got any, Kaitlin, as well, there's always that they want to help their parents. So, when you go into aged care, there's lots of fees, there's big costs to go in. And the initial thinking is, a lot of the time the wealth is tied up in the family home. And as we know, you can't just sell a property overnight. It takes time. It takes, could be a couple of months and things like that. And so what I see a lot is kids want to put their hands in their pocket and help their parents out financially. And whilst they've got the best of intentions, they just want to help support their parents, just like their parents have supported them throughout their lives. What they don't realize is it has a number of impacts. First of all, it impacts the aged care fees that they have to pay, because suddenly now they've got more, the parents in the eyes of Centrelink and the aged care home have more assets than what they actually have. So when they calculate fees and stuff, without getting too technical, they look at the assets that you have. So if the kids suddenly put up, help pay for the room, for argument's sake, the bond or the refundable accommodation deposit, or RAD, there's lots of acronyms with aged care. But what happens is that suddenly becomes an asset for when working out the parents' aged care fees. The other part of it is that a bond becomes an estate asset when the parents pass. So for argument's sake, I've got two older brothers. If I was to put my hand in my pocket, and my parents had to go aged care, and I put in a lump sum towards that money doesn't come straight back to me. That goes into the estate. And last thing we want is me to have an argument with my two brothers about that being my money, type of thing. And that can play out in family dynamics. Not every family's a happy family. So we just need to unpack that type of thing. And there's always those best intentions, as we said, but it's understanding what the implications are. And the one thing I'd say to people is the trouble with aged care, and when it happens, as we keep saying, it happens overnight. It really is an emotional time. Not only are you dealing with the emotions of having to put your parents into aged care, you want to make sure you're making the right decision. You put him in a house in a home that they're comfortable with. You're going to be dealing with potentially resistance from them to go in the home. Very rarely do I hear it from the other side where it's no, mum says she needs to go into care or dad needs to go into care. It's always, we have to put them in there. And you're always dealing with the clients where they say, oh yeah, it's been a hard week or two getting dad or mum settled into aged care. So emotions are running high. So people are making really quick snap decisions on how to fund the aged care, because they're going, oh, I need to pay a few $100,000 for a bond. I need to work out how they're going to fund the aged care fees. I don't even know what I've got to pay. So they're just reacting in the moment. And what I encourage people to realize is stop, pause. You don't have to make decisions and have the money the moment you go into aged care to fund everything. Yes, there's going to be certain fees payable and things like that. You've got time to make the right decisions. So the best thing to do, I would say, is focus on getting your parents into care, make sure it's the right home for them and that you're happy, and reach out to someone like us to help you understand, well, what are the costs of aged care and how can you fund it? Because that's where I've dealt with a case recently where, unfortunately, the person came to me after they'd done everything. They paid the bond, they'd done everything. And unfortunately, I couldn't help them, because once you pay the bond or once you make some certain decisions, unfortunately, once you've made those decisions and you've already acted on those decisions, there's not a lot that you can do to undo it. And that was a really hard conversation. So I would just encourage people, I know I've kind of gone on a tangent, but I'd encourage people to make sure that you focus on the emotional and getting your parents into the home care or aged care. And there's other, home care packages and stuff that might tick the boxes, and then reach out to someone to help you unpack the financial side of things.
Yeah, it's so true. And you say about, it's been really difficult putting your parents in. I know when we had to make that decision and we put dad into respite at the time and he ended up staying, he hated us for it, just absolutely hated it. And mum and I were the world's worst people in, it was terrible. I think mum really reflected on that. And so for the next, there was a big age gap between them. But for the next, 11 years, she always said, I'm never going to be a problem going in. And she had a fall. She was in hospital. And I remember the moment she rang me, I rang her and I'm saying, all right, I'm popping through. I'll pop past the house. Is there anything you want from home? And I was going on the way to the hospital. And she said, no, not really. Just an application for an old age person's place. And I almost fell off my chair, except that I was driving.
Yeah.
But you know what? It made my brothers and my life so much easier that she made the decision. And I think that was because we'd opened the conversation in the prior, dozen years, with her, and we'd had that open conversation. So from a personal point of view, I highly encourage, our listeners to talk to, whether it's your parents, talk to your parents, or parents talk to your kids about what you want, because it makes it so much easier versus, as you said, Peter, that knee-jerk reaction of making decisions on the fly and you really don't know what you're doing, or you don't know what mum and dad really want. So yeah, so it's difficult. So Kaitlin, to you, and this is probably a left field question. Often people say, but I don't get any Centrelink and I don't qualify for Centrelink. Why do I need to tell the government what I've got in terms of my assets when I go into aged care? Can you help us unpack that and why that is so without getting too technical and into the numbers?
Yeah, I think there's two sort of points to answer that question. And the first is that what people often don't realize is they might not be eligible for Centrelink now, but once they actually restructure all their assets to enter aged care, including maybe selling a family home and paying a bond or something like that, sometimes you do actually become eligible for some age pension that opens up an opportunity there. But the other more important one is that some of the fees that they use in aged care is actually calculated based on your means. It's a means-tested kind of fee. So it's important to let Centrelink know what you have, because if you have, below a certain amount, you will end up paying less fees. Whereas if you don't disclose anything, you'll end up paying the highest set of fees, which, can make a big difference on the longevity of how long your money's going to last if you're having to pay a higher fee than you otherwise would need to. So, yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. So I know we've sort of unpacked a fair amount in such a short period of time, but I'd love to ask you each, what are the key tips that you would leave our listeners with? So Peter, let me start with you.
Yeah, I think, look, hopefully my biggest couple of tips are, first of all, get your estate planning affairs in order. So make sure you got powers of attorney and they're the right people. And to unpack that a little bit, we have clients that sometimes, they choose the oldest sibling because that's what they feel they have to do. That's not necessarily the case. And sometimes when speaking to those people, you find out that maybe another sibling might be better suited to the role. The other thing as well is, as I said before, I know it's a highly emotional time. What you got to try and do is make yourself step back. Don't make quick knee-jerk decisions. Focus more on getting your parents into the right home for them and seek advice from someone who knows aged care and the funding system before you make any financial decisions on how you're going to fund that aged care. Because there's lots of things to unpack. And last thing you want to do, and Kaitlin might touch on it, but what I find our value with clients is how they're going to fund the aged care and what they can do to fund it, rather than, necessarily unpacking the fee. So, because that's the biggest worry. How am I going to fund aged care? And there's many ways to do it. It's just finding the right one for your parents and their situation, or whoever's going into care for their situation. So for me, it's get the estate planning thing sorted. Make sure that you focus on more on the emotional side and getting your parents into care, and seek help from someone to unpack the financial side. And I guess, where I've seen it with Kaitlin, I remember a client reached out to us recently who had just helped get their parents or get their dad into aged care. And the feedback from them was something along the lines of, we're really glad we've got you guys so you can sort out the finances while we have the time to spend with dad while he's still around.
Yeah, that's
the value.
It is. It's such an important time because that's when you realize that it's finite.
Yeah.
Yeah. Kaitlin, anything to add to Peter's comments?
Two things I want to add. I think first, a lot of the things from what we've all talked about today is about starting that conversation early, and a lot of times people don't want to talk about it, whether it's because they think I never want to go into aged care or I don't want to worry my kids by talking about it now. But I think even your story is evidence of that, Jenny, that it's actually really empowering to have those conversations early for the kids and for everyone to know, if the time comes, that we know what we need to do and what mum and dad wanted. So I really encourage people just to have those tough conversations. So for some people, it's not a high conversation, but for some people it is. Have those conversations. And secondly, something that we haven't touched on too much so far, but it's about sort of home care and getting help in the home. And getting that process started earlier as well can help, because the longer you can stay in the home and have support, the less chance you've got for things like having a fall or, going downhill quicker and things like that. So the more help you can get in the home, the better. And one of that is through the government, but people also forget that you can pay for private in-home help as well. So if you've got the means to do that, that's also potentially a great option, that you can get someone to come in and help you. And helps keep you in your home for longer.
Absolutely. So it reminds me of a story. But what if someone says, but I don't want someone in my home to help me?
That is a common one. Common one.
My mother was like that. So
Yeah.
So what do you have? What answers, solutions, comments do you have when someone says that?
Yeah, it is a common one. And it just depends on, I guess, how people, how they were brought up and what sort of values they have. But I think it's just reminding people, well, you can either have someone come in and help you and allow you to get to what you want to do and keep your daily tasks at home, even if it is a little bit uncomfortable at first. Or unfortunately, if you don't get this kind of help in the home, it means you're not being looked after, and we have to put you in aged care, mum or dad, if that's who you're having the conversation with. So that is a difficult one, and I empathise and understand where people are coming from with that. But it's just trying to get you the support that you need.
Absolutely. Well, they're great tips, and great conversation today. So I really encourage our listeners to sit back and, as Peter said, really pause and reflect and take your time without rushing into making decisions that you might regret down the track. So on that note, thanks for listening to Retirement, the Great Escape Plan. As we've said, retirement isn't about having everything figured out. It's about starting the right conversation, taking thoughtful steps over time. So please join us next time, where we'll actually bring what we've spoken today a little bit through into a real client story. So we'll be interviewing one of our clients who went through this when looking at it, from her mum's point of view, and the moments that really changed everything for them. So until next time, look after yourself, because thriving should be fun and naps should be epic. Thanks for listening to Retirement, the Great Escape Plan. If today's conversation raised questions for you or simply gave you something to think about, that's a great place to be. Retirement isn't about having everything figured out at once. It's about starting the right conversations and taking thoughtful steps over time. You'll find helpful resources and references related to this episode in the show notes. For more tips and insights and practical guidance, we also invite you to visit the JBS Financial website, where you'll find a range of tools and resources to support you at every stage of retirement. You can also follow JBS Financial on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and YouTube for ongoing conversations, updates, and ideas to help you plan well and live fully. Join us next time as we continue exploring what really means to plan well, live fully, and enjoy retirement on your terms. Because thriving should be fun and naps should be epic.